and welcome. We are so happy to have the opportunity this morning to have a conversation about the Western Hemisphere with specific reference to economic recovery and a path to renewed growth. And so these are the topics that we want to discuss today. My name is Eric Farnsworth. I head the Washington office of the Council of the Americas. For those of you who may not know, and I can't believe there's anybody who wouldn't know, but maybe there are, the Council of the Americas has been around for almost 60 years. We're based in New York. We have an office in Miami, of course, Washington, and we focus on bringing the public and the private sectors together across the Western Hemisphere to focus on democracy, open markets, and the rule of law. And we are very pleased to have the opportunity this morning to co-present this event with our on-the-ground partners, the Pacific Council on International Policy. All of you know that the PCIP, the Pacific Council, is one of the only international policy organizations on the West Coast, and they do a terrific job. I've been privileged over the years to participate in some of their activities and programs, and they really are an outstanding organization. As you know, they focus on elevating Los Angeles and California for impact on issues from the region, including Mexico and Latin America from a social, economic, and cultural perspective. Together with the Pacific Council, we, the Council of the Americas, are also grateful to Arizona State University's Los Angeles campus for the opportunity to use this wonderful facility, as well as the Thunderbird School for Global Management. And I want to give a special welcome to all of you who are joining us via webcast, and we know that there are hundreds, if not thousands of you out there, and we are very pleased that you've chosen to spend some of your day with us. Well, these are some unsettled times, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but across the world. There's no question about it. You know, as the leaders from the Western Hemisphere gathered this week in Los Angeles for the Summit of the Americas, there's a lot to discuss. We want to take a broader look today about the region, about its recovery, about prospects for growth, recognizing that we're coming out of a COVID pandemic, recognizing that inflation is spiking, recognizing that interest rates are increasing, and that's making the service of debt more challenging, debt that increased because of COVID. And we also recognize exogenous factors such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has directly impacted all of the world, not just Eastern Europe, of course, and Russia. But there are some bright spots too, perhaps. Commodities prices have buoyed growth in parts of the region in some ways. A strong dollar gives an opportunity for export-led growth from the Western Hemisphere. So it's not all terrible, and we want to explore some of these issues as well with all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have three terrific panelists. Their biographic information is on our website. We're not going to go deeply into it because we want to hear from them, not me. But to the extent you care to look at their biographic information, it's on www.as-coa.org, www.as-coa.org. To my immediate left, we have Felipe Jaramillo, who's the Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. Further over, we have Carolina España, who is the Executive Vice President for CAF, which is the Development Bank for Latin America, and we welcome you as well. And all the way over on the stage, we have, of course, Richard Martinez, who is the Vice President for Countries at the Inter-American Development Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming all of our panelists to this conversation this morning? Well, Felipe, we're going to start with you, just because I think you're next to me, so you're going to be the one that I torture first. But let's go to you for just some initial comments in terms of how you and how the bank are looking at the economic scenario for Latin America coming out of a really brutal pandemic. Where are we going? Where are we and where are we going?
Eric, thank you, and thank you to the Council of the Americas for this invitation. That's a tough question. Let me maybe make 3 points in answering that question. Point number one is we're having trouble with the level of uncertainty, have a real sense of what's going to happen in 2022 and 2023. I think what we were forecasting just a few months ago, say at the end of last year, was that 2022 was going to be a year of sort of continued recovery where we'd be coming down to normal, to a kind of a pre-pandemic normal. That's what it looked like. I think today we don't say that anymore. You know, we've had the war you just mentioned. We've had this problem of rising food prices, shortages of fertilizer, much higher oil prices, and that affects the region in, I think, more negative ways than positive ones. It's a mixed picture, but it has changed completely the storyline. So my second message is that I think 2022 is now looking darker than it did a few months ago for these reasons. And I think because overall, yes, oil exporters gain, and some of the food exporters gain, and I'm thinking especially Brazil, Argentina, but they don't gain that much. Both Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay and Paraguay have been affected by this massive drought over the last 8 or 9 months. So their crops have been very weak. So at a time when these powerhouses of cereal and oilseed production could be coming in on stream to help counteract the global situation, they're not doing as well. So it's a bit of a missed opportunity because of, you know, climate and the problems that's coming out of that. For many of the other countries, they are, I'm thinking of Central America, the Caribbean, they're huge food importers, net food importers. And these expensive food prices and the oil are a real problem for all of them as they were beginning to get out of the pandemic. So my final point, my third and final point is, I think, to your broad question of where are we going, I think 2022 is going to be a very tough year. The region is going to face handling not only this inflation problem that we've discussed, but you also mentioned higher interest rates. The Fed is going to keep increasing interest rates in the U.S. The U.S. economy will at some point begin cooling down, and growth in Latin America has been generally very associated with what's going on with the U.S. and the global economy. China is actually not doing very well. China is a big buyer of products from the South, from South America. So we are forecasting that growth this year will be around 2.5%. That's not a great rate, you know, per capita terms. That's below 1%. So I really think that the countries really need to think ahead of the kinds of reforms and policies that they need to snap out of this, because the future doesn't look that bright.
And that's 2.5% across the region. So obviously some a little bit better, but some even worse. No, some
Yes.
countries even worse.
Yeah, no, we have some countries very close to zero.
Yeah.
And then there's a few that are having a standout year, like Dominican Republic, Panama. Colombia is actually having still a surprising momentum from last year. It will come down in 2023, but it's a mixed picture, but mostly on the downswing. Last year we had growth of 7%.
Yeah.
So it's a big decline.
But the growth coming out last year was coming out of COVID, so a lot of that was recovery to pre-COVID.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let me turn to you, Carolina, because these are, I mean, Felipe has given us a sobering scenario, but I think absolutely accurate as well. But it's not a story that's new in Latin America. Underperformance, lowered growth, particularly in terms of emerging markets. One of the things that you've really contributed a lot to in terms of your own career has been the question of productivity across the region and the need to increase productivity to address some of these issues. I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about that. What can some of these countries in the region do to increase their own economic performance, can we put it that way, even in the context of a difficult global environment?
Thank you very much for the invitation, Eric, and thank you very much for the question. I think productivity, we've seen that productivity is one of the main problems of the region, and in basically, you know, the super cycle of commodities that ended in 2015 was one of the things that, you know, highlighted that we need to work on productivity. And there are many things that we need to do to tackle productivity and to have a more productive region that basically can have its growth, without depending on the prices of raw materials. And the problem has been that, as the countries in general have not tackled the reforms that are needed to do so. So there are at the firm level, there are many things that we need to do. We need firms to be innovative and also adopt technology. That's something that it's urgent in the region. From another, we also need to reduce informality. We need to have firms that provide quality jobs, that can afford to have these formal jobs. Then also we need to work on the skills of the workforce. That's very important also to basically increase productivity and tackle quality jobs. From another perspective, we also need more education. We need an educated workforce. We are going to, with the digitalization processes and also with the automation processes, there are many jobs that are going to disappear in the short term. So we need to educate our people to be ready for the work of the future, right? And those are very important aspects that we could do at the firm level. Other limitation is financing. We also need to provide financing and capital markets access to firms, so they can start their businesses, or they can continue work with their businesses. So those are limitations that need to be coupled with policies, with government policies and regulations that provide for all these actions that need to be accomplished. There are many programs in many of the countries that are looking at enabling these actions, but there's a lot needed to finish this task and to go ahead. From another perspective, there's also infrastructure. We need to investments in infrastructure for our businesses to be successful. We need transport, we need mass transport, we need electricity, we need roads, we need logistics, and there are, the region is lagging on those investments. Connectivity in the region, it's very complicated, and that's why maybe also the intra-trade in the region, it's only 16%. So there's a lot there to be done, and we know that in a scenario where fiscal limitations are limiting these investments because of these constraints, we need to mobilize private sector. And to mobilize private sector, we need also to have clear rules. We need to have a very good framework for investors, local investors, and private international investors to invest in our country. So I think maybe it's a very long answer to your question, but I think those are the main reasons, that we need to that productivity is not prospering in our regions, and those are, the issues that we need to work on to boost productivity and be able to insert our products in the value global value chains in the region, at a regional level, and at an international level.
No, thank you for that. I think that was terrific. A menu of activities that need to be addressed, and I think most of us would concur completely with what you were saying. I want to come back to the education question in a minute with Felipe, but let's go to Richard. You know, previous to this job with the IDB, or the Inter-American Development Bank, you were the finance minister of Ecuador. And you received accolade after accolade, Finance Minister of the Year, and all kinds of awards for your performance there, et cetera. But, and it was well deserved. But let me ask you to go back in your own mind to when you were minister. How did you address some of these issues that Carolina has been talking about, right? Because, I mean, we can talk about and decipher what the issues are, but when you're in public service, you actually have to address them. And it's a matter of political trade-offs and financing and the money available and what the priorities are. How do you think about these issues, and how did you come to some of your conclusions when you were minister?
Thank you, Eric, and happy to share the panel with Felipe and Carolina, and thank you for the invitation. I thought that those times were in the past. No, but yeah, I think that it is a crucial question, because I think that at the end of the day, the coin has two sides, right? And Felipe described very well the complicated scenario, and Carolina showed some topics that we could move forward in order to increase the productivity in the region. But I think that, regarding to your question, we have to be very creative in terms of the reforms in the region. And I think that we have two main opportunities now. The first one is on the private sector development. And when you say private sector, I can see opportunities in trade, in nearshoring, etc. But also, we are seeing a new generation of entrepreneurs in the region, which is incredible. And I am going to share some numbers about that. But on the other side, I think that we have a great opportunity to create room for sustainable growth. And just what you mentioned, because to do the reforms, it sounds easy, but it is more complicated to implement those reforms. But I think that we now have an opportunity to combine the macro fiscal reforms, the macro stability reforms that we need, and also microeconomic reforms. And when you see the private sector, for example, in terms of trade and nearshoring, we launched yesterday this number, $78 billion. That's the amount of exports that could be increased by the region, replacing the exports that came from Russia, from Ukraine, from China. So that's the opportunity that we have. And of course, we have to create the conditions in order to promote more agility in customs, integrate customs, and et cetera, e-commerce, et cetera, et cetera. And when I say nearshoring, I am not just saying to move the plants, but also to move the digital infrastructure to the region, because we have a lot of knowledge. And when you see the private sector, and you talk about this new generation of entrepreneurs, I want to share an additional number with you. The high-tech startups in the last 4 years grew at 300%, the number of high-tech startups. But the value of those high-tech startups grew by 600%. So it's incredible. We have a lot of unicorns coming from the region. You can see Argentina, Colombia, Uruguay, Brazil, now Ecuador. So it's incredible, the opportunity. And the message that those entrepreneurs are sending to the world is that we are here. We are world-class companies, and we want to produce global solutions, and as Carolina mentioned. And on the other side, in terms of the reforms, I think that, for example, if we can create room for some micro reforms, or reforms on the microeconomic side also, we can gain a lot of not just productivity, but also inclusion and social cohesion. Uh, some numbers here. For example, if you close the gender gap in the region, the GDP could increase by 7.7%. That's amazing. And if you, for example, think about the SMEs, you can see that the around 30 million of SMEs in the region, they account for the 99% of the total of the companies in the region, but they just account for the 25%. So we have to create conditions to those SMEs to come to the formality. And when you bring those companies to the formality, you increase the revenues for the government and etc. But there's like a golden key, if you want, to those reforms, to build those reforms. And that golden key is trust. We launched also this study at the IDB that says that 9 out of 10 people in the region trust in each other. So essentially, we are not trustable at all as a society. And trust is essential to create good businesses, to create the room for reforms in terms of the credibility of those reforms, and of course to create a good path to things like democracy and rule of law and etc. So I think that trust is like the golden key to those macro and micro reforms that we need. I think that we have a great opportunity there.
I'd love to explore that further, perhaps in another session in terms of trust, because this is actually, I've been doing this for over 30 years, and I think this is the first time that I've actually heard somebody bring that topic into a conversation about economic growth. Fascinating, and I'd love to explore it further. So thank you for drawing us into that type of conversation. And also, you know, your statistic about 7.7% increase in GDP just by closing the gender gap is extraordinary. I mean, those are gains that we're just leaving on the table. And the Vice President, of course, launched the In Her Hands initiative yesterday. Many of us were there, et cetera. But I think, you know, there's attention to that, there's effort there, but we clearly have to do more. Richard, thank you for those terrific comments. And as I promised, I want to explore the education question, because that is the issue that all three of you have talked about in some way, right? In order to be competitive and productive in a global economy, in a digitalized economy, Latin America has to do, and the Caribbean, really have to find a way to improve the educational attainment broadly, right? And you've talked about this with great authority, if I can say, Felipe, in terms of the education losses during COVID. How do we regain? How do we surpass even where we were before COVID? Not just regain, because that wasn't even good enough, if I can say that. But give us a way to think about this as education as an economic imperative for Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you, Eric, for that question. Yes, I am very worried because there's been a silent crisis on education over the last 2 years since the pandemic started. And the reason I say it's a silent crisis is because I don't see enough concern and agitation about it. When fuel prices go up in our countries, people walk out into the streets and demonstrate, or when food prices go up. But when children stop going to school for, in most places, a year and a half, maybe 2 years, there's no realization of what that implies for their future. So in our estimate, children have lost at least a year and a half, in many places 2 years of schooling across the region, the bulk of them. And according to our studies and our estimates, if they leave the formal schooling system and enter the labor force, for their entire work life, they will earn somewhere between 10 and 15% less than their parents, than people that actually had received that education. And this is a complete debacle, not only for the welfare of this next generation, but for all of Latin America, for the economies, for you know, the entire continent. So I feel that we're not paying enough attention to this silent crisis. I was very happy that just last week we had an event to raise awareness. We had the presidents of Argentina, of Chile, of Ecuador, of Honduras, raising the awareness that this needs to be done first thing. And it's actually not that hard, but it does require an effort to first bring the kids back to school, assess where they are, how much they've lost. Second, design quick catch-up plans. And third, support and train the teachers. And do this as quickly as possible before it's too late. And maybe to end, Eric, we had a huge education challenge before the pandemic. And sadly, I think this should be priority number one. We are very concerned, we all are in Latin America, about inequality. You know, and we see the tensions and the rage in the streets. People are very unhappy about inequality. And the root of it is a poor public education system. When the bulk of the population, especially the vulnerable and the poor, get very bad quality education, it's just going to reproduce the same inequality in the future. So we really need big changes and a big commitment on this agenda going forward.
And how much would you say is attributable to technology as well? I mean, during COVID, of course, nobody was going to school physically, but at least in the developed countries, many students were going to school virtually. That didn't happen across much of Latin America. Is that an area where quick catch-up can be made, or is that also something that's going to continue to drag on the educational attainment of students? And then I want to ask a similar question to you, Carolina, but from your perspective, Felipe.
I'll tell you, Eric, you know, I was more optimistic a year ago because a number of countries experimented with digital education. While they had their schools closed, they tried to impart classes through digital means. We knew that the lowest, the people with the lowest incomes did not really have very good access to digital means. Maybe they would have a phone. They had 3 or 4 kids in the house. They somehow had to share that phone to see. So we knew it wasn't perfect, but I was hoping that this would shed a light on alternative ways of educating. But our teams are doing now evaluations on how much was learned. And I have to tell you, so far the results are really not good. This digital education still has a long ways to go. And that's why I think we need to, at best, make it hybrid, some in person, some digital. But most importantly, I think the kids need to get back to school, and we need to launch these catch-up programs.
Well, that's very consistent from our own experience, isn't it? I mean, all of us have said at one point or another, in person is infinitely better than doing meetings virtually. We all recognize that, right, as adults and parents and everything else. So it would make sense that it would affect the education as well. Carolina, from the perspective of the multilateral banks, and you see the issue now, you see the challenge, you see the problems and difficulties, how is CAF specifically, but also the IFIs, the International Financial Institutions, how are you viewing these issues as with an eye to addressing them? In other words, are you looking at education primarily as a technological issue with a technological fix? Is it an issue of, physically getting kids to schools? How's the lending and support that you all are providing into the region? What are you focusing on in the education perspective, if I can ask?
Very much, Eric. Well, I would add to what Carlos Felipe mentioned is that one of the things that is important in Latin America, it's also internet access. The region lacks of internet access, so that's one of the aspects for technological education. But I totally agree with Carlos Felipe and with you, with your view. We need to bring the kids back to school. I think the kids, I guess, especially the younger kids, need to be at school to learn. I think it's essential, and we think that we need to improve the quality of education in the region. That's very important. We are focusing on infrastructure in education, but also in raising the quality of education that at all levels. in particular the younger kids. So so that's our view, and we totally agree with the view. We think it's we need the kids to go to school because, you know, quality and then the assessment there. When you have kids at school, you know, if their parents are working, then they may not be totally focused on what the teacher is it's teaching. And I guess, you know, all of us have had that experience with our own kids, and sometimes, what are you doing? You know, they need to go to school. They need to focus, and they need somebody that looks at them and looks at what are they doing. So in our view, we are focusing on infrastructure, but also quality of education to assess the countries and to help them with their education plans.
I think one of the things that's come out of the pandemic for everybody, no matter developed, developing nation, whatever, is a renewed appreciation of teaching and of teachers as a profession, and the fundamental importance of the teacher in the classroom as a driver of educational attainment. I mean, there's no substitute. There really isn't. Thank you for bringing that perspective. I think it's exactly right. Richard, let me change the focus a little bit, you know, to look ahead. Where can we anticipate drivers of growth coming from in the region? Is it going to come from exports? Is it going to come from increasing productivity? Carolina mentioned the very low level of intra-regional trade, that's an area of opportunity. Is it going to come from direct foreign investment? Maybe a combination of everything. What do you see as the key drivers of growth? And from the private sector perspective, because we have many private sector representatives in the audience, where do you see some particularly promising sectors that might be contributing to a growth profile in the Western Hemisphere?
Just let me make a comment on the
Please,
education,
please.
because for the IDB, and I think that for all IFIs is a top priority, and for the IDB, of course. And we analyze the number of days of school that were lost in the middle of the pandemic, and we found that 237 days were lost by our kids by the pandemic. And the thing is how you are going to recover that room. So if you think in the region, the history of the education reforms, the first generation reforms were to build schools. The second generation was to give to the system high quality. And now I think that we have to combine, of course, because we have a lack of schools and a lack of quality yet in some countries, but we have, as my colleague said here, to move forward to a new generation, the third generation of reforms, which includes digitalization. And digitalization not just in the way that we have to help our teachers and our students to have more access, but in terms of the skills of the future, right? And that's something that it is going to take some time, and we have to work together with the countries, because you have, of course, to invest more in education, but you have on the other side these fiscal constraints. So how do you solve the problem? And what we are doing at the IDB is we have created a tool, very dynamic, which help to the ministers of education to find efficiencies on their own sector. So the dialogue with the Minister of Finance is very different. And you come with, of course, a win-win situation. And but totally agree, education is and has to be the number one, the priority. And in terms of your question, I think that, Eric, it is important to emphasize that the engine of growth is the private sector. Sometimes it is not too clear in the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, in some countries. So it isn't, I totally understand your perspective, but I think that we have to re-emphasize that, and the private sector is going to lead and has to lead the recovery. because there are not more resources in the region. And so the government has to create the conditions to that private sector. In terms of sectors, for example, if you think the Russia's war, and of course, a war is not good news for anybody, but you can see opportunities, for example, in stone, fish, minerals, oil and gas that are going to benefit the growth of some countries, but of course you want to translate to a new, clean matrix, and grains, you name it. You have a lot of opportunities there. And when you think on the effects of the China supply mainly, you can think of the pharmaceutical sector, you can think of the textile sector, and you have a lot of opportunities there. But I think that we have to, if we want to look to the future, we have to think of social inclusion, fintech, that we have a great opportunity there, and of course, associated to that, digitalization. And the second pillar, I would say that that is climate change, because we think climate change only as a responsibility, and that's of course perfect, but we have to see also the opportunity there. We made this research with ILO, International Labour Organization, and we found that if we the path towards decarbonization could create until 2030 15 million jobs. And in terms of I don't know, just clean energy, forestry, and all those sectors that are associated with, of course, goal objectives. So I think that we have to find the opportunities on the financial side, and the fintechs, and the digitalization associated to that, and on the climate change. I think that we have a lot of opportunities there.
Terrific, thank you. And let's come back to Felipe, because you've laid out, all of you have used the word digital several times, whether it's in education, development, private sector, opportunities, et cetera. It's clearly part of the conversation, and it needs to be. How can, frankly, the region, but also the United States, working together with the region, perhaps through the trade agenda, how can we together promote some of these issues? Richard, you've been talking about, but Felipe, you started your career doing trade issues, right? And, that's when we first got to know each other many years ago. I won't say how many. But you've been a strong advocate and an effective advocate for the use of trade to promote broader goals. What are some of the things we could think about in this context, knowing that the leaders from the region are here in Los Angeles this week talking about some of these things? Let me put it differently. If you had a magic wand, what would you ask them to do on the trade side to help support some of these priorities?
Thank you for bringing that subject up, dear to my heart. I would ask them to reinvigorate the trade agenda, period, as simple as that. I feel that the region has really put this in the back burner. And I guess, there's three issues that worry me. The same old one that Latin America missed the boat on trade. Ironically, when this summit started here in the U.S. back in 1994, that was a long time ago, but it was trade, the issue, can we trade more within the hemisphere, within Latin America? We heard the numbers. I think Carolina was mentioning it's really low still. And we saw other countries in other regions pick up the trade agenda, and that's how they developed. Trade, well managed, can lead to great growth, great investment, and lots of poverty reduction and improvements in inequality. And Latin America missed the boat on this. So I would tell them, look, it is high time to bring it back. Why? Well, look, if we look at trade of the region over the last 20 years or so, there's been some growth. But interestingly, the bulk of the growth is with partners outside the region. And sadly, in my view, a lot of it is commodity driven. Still, the old Latin America, we export food, raw food products, raw minerals, We don't process them. There's very little value added. And a lot of this growth, we have to admit, we look at the numbers, has been going to China. And, it has its positives, but it doesn't have a real strong development and inclusive development punch. And so my final point here is I would tell them, look, the agenda is different today because of the reasons both Carolina and Richard mentioned. Digital has really changed the picture. So you can do now services trade. You can do e-commerce. And countries are trying to beef up that agenda, but I think there's a missing element of regional thing. Richard also mentioned, and I really fully buy into that, this whole climate debate is opening up opportunities. A bunch of South American countries have lithium. Well, let's find ways to use that lithium well. Copper, of course, is going to be continue to be very important for this whole revolution. At least 3 or 4 countries have massive potential for green hydrogen in the north of Chile, somewhere in central Brazil. This is a game changer. Everybody's looking for green hydrogen as the big new renewable that is clean, that is really going to revolutionize the future. Latin America has all that potential. And finally, there's the forests. Latin America has, the Amazon has huge amount of ability to capture carbon. And that can be remunerated. And so we can play a huge role. So I see huge opportunities. I would tell them, guys, wake up. We got to reinvigorate the trade agenda.
Thank you for that strong message, and I fully concur, as you know. But you also mentioned the word lithium. It is fascinating to watch how the whole lithium segment is being developed in Latin America right now with, if I can say this is a personal view, not an institutional view, the recreation of all the mistakes of the past. I mean, we've done this before. We've seen how it ends. And yet we continue to do the same things. And, lithium, in my personal view, is a massive opportunity. But I don't want to get off on that discussion too much. But no, your comments, I think, were very well made. And Carolina, let me turn to you. You've done a lot of work in debt markets, in financial sustainability, at the macro level, et cetera. There is, as we talked about at the very beginning of this conversation, an increasing debt load across the region that's more difficult to service with rising interest rates, et cetera. If we don't have a robust trade agenda where countries might be able to grow out of, difficulty to be able to service their debt, what are we going to be able to do? What are the other alternatives that might be available? I mean, is the CAF going to come with a whole basket of new lending, for example, or the IDB? Or I'm not suggesting you are. I'm just being provocative here. But I mean, the point is, what are the alternatives here? What are some of the things that people are thinking about in terms of trying to put these economies back on a sustainable footing?
Yeah, I thank you very much, Eric, and. I think we have to go back to and CAF, and I think all my colleagues at the World Bank and at the IDB would agree on these, I think. But we have to assess the countries, and to assess the countries in order to improve productivity, and I guess improve productivity and reduce inequality are the key issues that all the countries need to tackle in order to promote growth. And basically, we need to promote growth, and that's the only way that that countries are going to be able to accomplish development and better quality of life to their inhabitants. And the two words, productivity and inequality, they imply a lot of things and a lot of reforms and a lot of work behind that. It means inclusion. It means promoting trade, in facilitating trade, interregional trade within other continents as well as the American. And I think the United States have a great opportunity, like Carlos Felipe was mentioning, with green energy or with clean energy in the region. There are a lot of opportunities to invest in those projects. And I think that's something that also could, investment in infrastructure in general, it's something that's going to underpin the growth of the region. I guess also, global value change, we should look at with the concept of nearshoring. Well, first, insert our countries in regional value chains, and then in the global value chains as well. So it's something that we should aim at. And with the United States, I think there's a great opportunity to do so. Investment in general terms, it's going to, I guess it's a combination of two things: countries improving their frameworks, their regulations to boost productivity and inequality, but also foreign direct investment, attracting foreign direct investment into these infrastructures that are going to boost productivity for all the continent. I would say that.
One of the things that I hope comes out of this summit this week is a renewed desire by U.S. companies in particular to look south, to look to Latin America and the Caribbean in the first instance for investment opportunities. Okay, maybe there's investment in the region is complicated, but I don't think it's any more complicated than going to China or some other economies in the world. And so I hope that that focus happens. And I also hope that some of the countries in the region also recognize that in order to attract that private sector investment, there are some things that need to be done to make the economies more attractive. And we've all been talking about that. And I don't think there's any secrets here. And some countries are proactively attempting to do that, and other countries aren't. But the ones that are more aggressively doing that, I think, will reap the benefit over time. Based on domestic reforms, et cetera. We don't have a lot of time remaining. Richard, let me turn to you probably for the last question or last response. The IDB has done some really important work with reference to China. And I'm asking this question because Felipe has raised it in the context of trade and commodities, and it's not necessarily a development-heavy driver of effective development. Let's put it that way. I mean, some people benefit, of course, but development broadly it's not a model that probably most of us would seek in a general way. But you've also been, as we talked about, in a very senior level position in a government that has extensive dealings with China as a pragmatic issue, investment, trade, et cetera. How would you recommend, or how should we think about the Chinese relationship with Latin America? I mean, is this something to be concerned about? Is it something to be, benign about, unconcerned about? Are there some positives, some negatives? I mean, just give us a way, maybe a framework to help think about this very real and growing relationship. I mean, China is the top trade partner of almost every country, if not every country now, in South America.
Oh, great question, Eric. And from my previous experience, and I think that applies to the current situation, I think that you have to move on concepts, right? Transparency, sustainability, labor rights. So those are concepts that you have to put in the table with any country, but especially with China. And that's something that, as you mentioned, in my previous life, I brought to my country. And I think that those are values. Those are values that I think that we have a great opportunity now in the summit to show to the world that at the end of the day we have a great opportunity to create a strong partnership or to strengthen the partnership with the U.S. and Latin America and the Caribbean, going back to your question. Because at the end of the day, it takes two to tango, right? And I think that the Latin America and the Caribbean countries are not looking for aid. I think that they are looking for opportunities. And I think that, of course, those opportunities come with responsibilities. I think that we have a lot to do in terms of trade facilitation, in terms of e-commerce, as Felipe mentioned. And yesterday we had this meeting with all the ministers of foreign affairs and ministers of trade of the region, and that was the main conclusion. We need to strengthen the policies to support the private sector to increase their opportunities. But also, I think that we have a great opportunity as IFIs, right? And the summit yesterday has been launched, the press release, and it is going to be announced a great recalibration, if you want, of the IDB Invest, our private sector branch. And the idea is essentially to use the AAA of the bank in order to de-risk and to open opportunities for private or institutional investors. So the agenda in terms of the IDB, and I think that's the future, it has to be public and private. We have to look for those synergies. And we are working now, for example, in Mexico. You mentioned before in a previous conversation, we are trying to focus on a specific region, for example, in Mexico and South-Southeast. If you compare the levels of poverty and GDP per capita, for example, GDP per capita in South-Southeast is like 1/3 if you compare it with Mexico, and if you compare the poverty in the South-Southeast, it's like 55% if you compare with the North states. So we are working there together with the government in order to create opportunities in Oaxaca state, Buenaventura, etc. And what we are doing there is to create room for the private sector, upskilling, reskillings, and to open, of course, alliances for PPPs. So I think we have a great opportunity. That's my message. Of course, a lot of challenges, but we have to try to see those challenges as opportunities in order to create a sustainable growth and more social inclusion as we all desire.
Well, I think that's a great way to bring to a close our conversation this morning. You know, the Summit of the Americas periodically, but generally speaking about every 3 years, is an opportunity to bring together the region, but even people who don't focus on regional issues to take a look at the region in a new way each time, right? It's a point in time to take stock of where we are. And what I really hope comes out of this is precisely what we've been talking about, a renewed emphasis, even enthusiasm for the hemisphere, a sense of possibility, a sense that, frankly, these are some big challenges that we cannot address on our own, speaking now as a North American, but, you know, I think the whole region would probably agree with that, whether it's global climate change, migration, job creation, education, all of these things. But we have to find a way, in my view, to do this in a way that's mutually beneficial, mutually respectful, and finding a way forward in a pragmatic, measurable way. Because the region is, if we don't, we're going to fall further and further behind to our other competitors globally, and that's my sermon for the day. But I do want to really congratulate each of you and thank you for your presence with us, your comments, your wisdom in terms of what was behind your answers and responses. And I hope that all of us are taking away from this a renewed sense of possibility again for the region and hopefulness for what we can achieve together, recognizing some of the difficulties that face us along the way for sure. For those of you who have been watching us on the live stream, we appreciate your time and attention, and we wish you were here in person. We'll get you next time. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking our panelists for their terrific comments this morning. And that will conclude our program. Thanks again to the Pacific Council, to Arizona State. And this is Eric Farnsworth with the Council of the Americas. Hope to see you again very, very soon. Thanks a lot.